So the stitch we use for the grass is a Nobuko stitch. I've already done some on my demonstration canvas, and I'm continuing across my grass area. The Nobuko stitch has a stitch on the diagonal over 3 threads, followed by a stitch that goes over 1 thread. So on the left side of the grass, I'm using a light colored thread, and I'm taking it to a design line in the middle of the grass area where I'm going to pick up a shadow from the tree. When I reach that area, I'll change threads, but I don't want to change stitches. So I'm just going to bring that down as though I'm doing a second row. So my last stitch for the light area, use the light color thread. And now I'm going to continue with my Nobuko stitch pattern in the dark color thread. So you don't want to compensate your stitch length when you change from the lighter area to the darker shadow area under the tree. Now, when I'm coming back in the other direction, I'm going to change the stitch length. So where I went over 1 thread before, I am now going to go over 3 threads. And notice with this dark shadow that I'm actually going right over the design line. That's fine, it's just a guideline. And you can choose to go over it or stay under it. Either way is just fine. And now that I'm into the area of my light grass, again, I'm going to pick up the Nobuko stitch with my light thread and continue across until I reach the design line on the other side. You're going to notice that your fabric shows at the top or the bottom of this design area. Do compensation stitches. Don't be tempted to lengthen your stitch. At the top of the design area, you may wish to place a long horizontal stitch. You can do this to either cover exposed canvas or just to divide the grass from the garden area above. For the sky, we're going to use a thread blending technique. And that's when you stitch with strands of different colors in your needle. By changing the mix of colors, you can gradually shift from one color to the next, thereby achieving a sense of perspective. Now, our sky has a very subtle color change, but it will be lighter at the horizon and become darker as you go to the top design line. Let's take a look at the chart. So let's first look at the blending for the 18 count canvas, which is on the left. For the top 6 rows at the top of the design line, you're going to place in your needle 4 strands of dark thread and none of the light thread. Then the next 2 rows will be a combination 3 strands of dark thread and 1 of light. And then the next 3 rows have 2 strands of dark and 2 strands of light. And you continue down that chart until you reach your horizon line. At the bottom, you might have 6 or 7 rows. It just depends on where your design line is. Now for linen and Congress cloth, we can't use as many strands, and we also don't have the same number of rows. So the top 8 rows, you have 2 strands of dark thread and none of the light. And then for the next 7 rows, 1 strand of each, and then the remaining rows toward the horizon, just 2 strands of light thread. So the sky is stitched using a T-stitch. Because this is at the top of your piece, you may want to turn your canvas or your linen 180 degrees so that you're not reaching across all of your stitching in order to get to the sky. And if you change your work 180 degrees, you also want to remember to change your chart 180 degrees. So I've already started stitching my first row. My stitch goes over 1 canvas thread on the diagonal. I'm skipping a channel, coming up again, going over 1 canvas thread, and I do that until I reach my design line. Now when I do my next row, I come down right underneath the tail of the stitch above, take my needle down, I'm going in the opposite direction, I am skipping 2 fabric threads or 1 channel, and again going over the tail of my previous stitch. So when I'm changing from one combination of threads in my needle to the next, I want to integrate the colors so that I get a smooth transition from one to the other. So let me show you on this little diagram. I'm doing some stitches in the red color for 2 rows and moving down to my next row. And what I'm going to do is skip a couple of stitches, carry my thread, and then continue to do a few more stitches, again skipping a couple, and then again filling in for the remainder of my row. Now I'm going to change to the second combination of strands in my needle, and for my next row I'm going to illustrate in green my next combination. So I'm doing my stitches, and as I get to that area that I had skipped above, I am going to fill them in with this other combination of threads. Continue my row, and again come back in and fill in the missing stitches and then finish my row. Now I'm ready to continue in my new combination of threads for my next area of stitching. For our clouds, we're going to use unraveled nylon. This is a nylon tube, and you know it unravels at the worst of times when you're stitching with it, but in this case we want to consciously unravel it. So I'm going to try to show you. I have a cut edge. It's going to take me a little while to try to find one of the filaments. There it is. I got it. And I'm going to pull that filament slowly because hopefully it's not going to pick up other filaments and tangle. And I'm going to keep pulling. Sometimes I can pull that filament. Now I do have a second filament, I see it, but it's also kind of unzipping back and forth as I'm pulling. Some cases I pull the filament one direction and I can pull my nylon tube in the other direction. And what I want to achieve is all of this nylon tube completely pulled apart, and I'm going to get a little puff ball of nylon filaments. Now I'm going to place them on top of my sky in what looks like a very natural cloud. So it's just going to lay on top of my sky, and I have in my needle an invisible stitching thread, which is also nylon, and I'm going to take that needle to the back and tack the nylon in place at a couple of places. I really don't need to do this in very many places to tack it down. You're just never going to see that invisible thread going through all of those nylon strands. When I do that across my cloud, it's going to be anchored in place.
Okay, I'm ready.
So our sky is stitched, and now it's time to do the leaves of the tree. I'm going to layer a lot of lazy daisy stitches. And to make a lazy daisy stitch, I come up through my fabric and down again in the same fabric hole, or very close to it. I can use my laying tool to get the size of the leaf I want. I leave a small loop, and then I'm going to do a little tacking stitch right at the edge of my loop to hold it in place. So I'm going to scatter these leaves, again up in one fabric thread, down in the same thread, leaving a loop, a small loop, maybe only 1/8 of an inch or so. It depends on whether you're stitching on linen and Congress cloth or canvas, what the size of your loop will be. Coming up inside the loop and doing a little tacking stitch to hold it in place. I'm starting at the top design line and working my way down so that I can be putting leaves right on top of each other. And when I do the leaves around the tree, scatter them across here, bring them down almost to where the branches meet the trunk, but not quite. And as you go across your canvas, go about 1/3 of the way. Don't go right into the middle. Be a little bit shy of the center of your work for ending the leaves that go on the tree. Underneath the tree are some, I'll call them ferns. They have individual leaves that are done in a needle weaving technique. So I have placed a straight pin which goes into my fabric at the tip of the leaf, and I am going to take a thread around that needle, making my leaf as long as I would like it to be. So I'm going up at A, around the needle, coming back down again at B, and now bringing my thread up between both sides of that loop. What I'm going to do is weave back and forth around these two threads. So I go over one thread and under it, coming up in the middle, And now I'm going in the opposite direction, under and over, just weaving back and forth, under and over. Now I want to keep a fairly consistent tension in my thread so that I keep a consistent width on the leaf, over and under. And after I do a couple of those passes, I can tuck the thread down so that it's not too loose from the base of that leaf. And I just continue this process of going under and over those two threads until I get up toward the tip of the pin. So my needle weaving now has come all the way to where the pin has entered the canvas. I will take that pin out and take my needle through that loop one more time where the pin had been located. There's a tiny little hole. Let's see if I can get through it. There we go. Now I can place this leaf in different angles. Let me just show, for example, that I can turn it over, I can angle it, and take my needle down to hold it in place. And if I have a very, very strong angle, I might want to also tack it down below so that it holds that position. So I'll bring my needle up close to the leaf, kind of follow one of my prior stitches, take it down, and that's going to hold that leaf in place while I do other leaves surrounding it. After you've done all your stitching, you may find some finishing touches that will just help make this scene pop. First of all, you want to check to be sure that none of the canvas shows where you would like it to be covered. For example, between the hedge and the tree trunk, you may see canvas. You can use a single strand of your hedge thread just to repeat the stitches in that area to cover the canvas. You may find some elsewhere as well. I like to take some long stitches to highlight some of the areas. For example, along the walkway, I've taken long stitches in a dark thread all the way up along the side to highlight the walkway and help give it some separation from the flower beds. You'll also notice that there are long stitches between these lower garden areas. There is a long stitch underneath the hedge here as well. And here between these light colored threads, the yellow and the blue, notice again some long stitches that come part of the way, but not all of the way to the tree trunk. Just use your eye to see if there is an area where you feel placing a thread or an outline might be helpful. Artists do this all the time, outlining areas, and you certainly can too. So I hope you've enjoyed stitching Spring Garden, and I thank you for taking the class. And again, I especially want to thank the Greater Pacific Region for inviting me to teach the class in this film presentation.